She was the quiet pilot nobody bothered to remember until a single name written on a whiteboard before the entire squadron changed everything. No one expected her to top the list, and absolutely no one foresaw what would happen when she did. She was the kind of aviator people forgot was even in the room, not because she lacked presence, but because she never gave anyone a reason to look twice. Then her name appeared at the top of the board at Fallon, and the entire briefing room suddenly forgot how to breathe. Lieutenant Junior Grade Avery Mercer checked into Naval Air Station Oceana on a crisp Tuesday in late September. She carried a single sea bag slung over her shoulder and a set of orders folded into an envelope so well worn that its creases had softened like cloth. At 25, standing just 5'3" in flight boots, she possessed a face people later struggled to describe, not plain or truly forgettable, but calm in a way that let casual glances slide right off. She stepped into the ready room of Strike Fighter Squadron 22, located an empty chair in the back row, and sat down without uttering a word. Nobody stood up. Nobody offered a handshake or a welcoming nod. A few pilots glanced briefly at her fresh name tape before returning to their lukewarm coffee. VFA 22 carried a heavyweight reputation, the kind of frontline squadron whose call signs command genuine respect across the fleet. The ready room smelled like every ready room in naval aviation: burnt dark roast, dry erase markers, and the faint, indelible tang of JP-5 jet exhaust baked permanently into Nomex flight suits. Carrier trap photos lined the bulkhead, while a corkboard near the hatch stood 3 layers deep in mission patches accumulated over a decade of combat deployments. Lieutenant Commander Garrett Stone ran training operations with the effortless composure of an aviator who had never once second-guessed himself in a cockpit. He checked Delgado's name against the roster, offered a brief, measured nod, and spoke. "Delgado, workup starts Thursday. Keep your head up and don't slow anybody down." It wasn't hostile, but it was far from a warm welcome. The loudest presence in the room belonged to Lieutenant Chase Decker, call sign Hammer. 4 years in Super Hornets, a combat cruise under his belt, and the sort of sprawling confidence that occupied a room before he even crossed the threshold. Beside him sat Lieutenant Tara Patel, call sign Riddle, a tactician so sharp that instructors routinely briefed scenarios twice because she would pinpoint the logical flaw before they finished drawing the diagram. Toward the front, arms folded across his chest, sat Lieutenant Commander Marcus Adebayo, call sign Steel, senior enough that he no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. Mara had no call sign. In a fleet squadron, new junior officers did not receive one until the wardroom decided they had earned it. Until then, they were merely a surname spoken flatly. For the first 2 weeks, she ate her meals alone, answered directly when addressed, and volunteered nothing beyond what was strictly required. Some assumed she was simply overwhelmed by the transition. Hammer assumed she was entirely out of her depth, and he chose to say so out loud in front of 8 other pilots on a Wednesday afternoon. "Delgado, you sure admin didn't mix up your paperwork? You've got some real library energy going on. No offense." A couple of pilots chuckled. Riddle didn't laugh, but she didn't speak up either. Mara simply closed her NATO PS manual, met his gaze, and let the quiet room answer for her. Commander Ferris stood by the coffee pot. He heard the exchange, filed it away, and said nothing. Not yet. What no one in that room understood, because Mara never felt the need to advertise it, was the path that had brought her to that chair. She had grown up on the outskirts of El Centro, New Mexico. just 2 blocks from a Marine Corps air station, where F-A-18s ran approach patterns so relentless that the neighbors tuned them out completely. Everyone except Mara. Her uncle had flown agricultural sprayers over the desert cotton fields. He took her up for the first time when she was 8 years old, strapped securely into a jump seat built for an adult twice her frame. Something inside her had settled into deep stillness the moment the wheels left the dirt. Not fear, but the exact opposite of fear. By 15, she was flying those duster runs herself at dawn, skimming low beneath power lines, learning to read the wind the way other teenagers skimmed textbooks they didn't care about. She learned how a thermal ripples through cotton rows before the airframe registers it, and how an aerodynamic stall doesn't shout its arrival, it whispers. She clawed her way through a state university aviation program on student loans, late-night diner shifts, and an obscure scholarship nobody back home had ever heard of. When her Navy commissioning envelope finally arrived, nobody threw a parade. Her mother hugged her goodbye at the bus depot and told her she could always come back home if things got too hard. Mara nodded, though she never once entertained that thought as a realistic option. During flight school in Corpus Christi, she maintained that same quiet discipline. It wasn't timidity, it was an instinct for economy. She refused to waste words just as she refused to waste altitude, airspeed, or fuel. Instructors noted that while she asked fewer questions than her peers, she consistently knew the exact procedure when called upon. She graduated at the very top of her class, a detail that never surfaced at Lemoore simply because nobody thought to ask. The ensuing weeks in the Imperial Valley moved the way grueling training blocks always do, endless while enduring them, yet a blur in retrospect. Pre-dawn simulator sessions gave way to long academic lectures that stretched deep into the afternoon, followed by demanding low-level navigation routes through the Cascade Range foothills that left everyone soaked in sweat. Mara kept pace effortlessly, never flashy, never falling behind. Flying razor-clean sorties and debriefing in crisp, precise sentences. While the rest of the junior officers headed out to the local spots after hours, she returned directly to the bachelor officer quarters. What people noticed was her silence. What they failed to see were the midnight hours she spent alone in the squadron tactics vault, running intercept geometry on scratch paper until three-dimensional trigonometry transformed into pure, unthinking instinct. She claimed the grueling 0400 simulator slots that everyone else avoided, and methodically read through every single mishap report in the squadron safety library. She did this not because it was assigned, but because she wanted to understand every conceivable way an otherwise competent pilot could lose an aircraft, ensuring she would never make the same mistake. There was a specific flight in late November that no one in the squadron remembered except her. During a high-speed, low-altitude run through the mountain corridors, a subtle sensor fault began feeding corrupted radar altimeter data at the worst possible moment. Most junior aviators with her flight hours would have trusted the digital glass displays. Mara didn't. Something in the aircraft's kinesthetic feedback, the subtle mush of the stick and the visual flow of the terrain, failed to align with the panel numbers. She ignored the faulty readouts, flew the jet on pure aerodynamic feel, leveled off safely, and brought the multi-million-dollar machine back without a scratch. She logged 3 concise lines about the discrepancy in her personal flight book and never brought it up in the ready room. To her, it wasn't a heroic sea story. It was merely the exact same flying instinct her uncle had drilled into her above the New Mexico cotton fields a decade prior. Her roommate, a logistics officer named Priya, no relation to Riddle, often noticed the strip of light glowing under Mara's bedroom door well past midnight. She frequently saw Mara head out toward the flight line, looking as if she had already been awake for hours. Because she had been. Tara once asked, half teasingly, if Mara ever bothered to sleep. Sometimes, Mara replied evenly, leaving it at that. Her roommate didn't realize that the sleep Mara sacrificed was never a burden to her. It was simply the exact same trade she had made her entire life. Pre-dawn crop duster runs over sleeping in, late diner shifts over a typical social life. She never believed that relentless preparation was too steep a price to pay. In February, an official message announced 2 coveted quotas for the Advanced Tactics Detachment at Naval Air Station Fallon, the premier training program feeding the Navy's elite strike fighter tactics instructor pipeline, where 6 grueling weeks could define the trajectory of a career. Hammer announced his intention to submit an application before the briefing slide even changed. Riddle voiced her interest in a quieter tone. Steele merely nodded, which the wardroom understood to mean his package was already moving. Nobody noticed Mara quietly slip into the administrative office that afternoon to hand in her completed package. Selection was notoriously unforgiving. Historically, fewer than 1 in 5 nominated pilots made the cut, and the review board was ruthless regarding flight logs, simulator evaluations, and an exhaustive series of written tactical exams that weeded out the majority before they ever touched a stick. 3 weeks later, the final selection message landed in Commander Ferris's inbox. He read through the dispatch once, paused, read it a second time, and immediately called an all-hands muster in the ready room. The pilots settled into their chairs, assuming they already knew how the cards had fallen. Hammer's slot, probably Riddle's, or perhaps Steele heading out to instruct. Commander Ferris held the printout at his side for a quiet second, deliberate and measured, the way a leader pauses when he intends every single syllable to land. "One name came back selected," Ferris stated, his voice cutting through the hum of the air conditioning. "Top of the board's entire ranking. Highest tactical academic score submitted across the entire master jet base this cycle. Perfect marks on the Advanced Intercept Geometry exam, the one that routinely eats candidates alive." He surveyed the room slowly, letting the silence build, before reading the dispatch clearly. "Lieutenant Junior Grade Avery Mercer." The ready room froze. It wasn't the ordinary hush of a briefing, but the absolute stillness that occurs when a newly revealed reality shatters a comfortable assumption. Hammer stopped mid-motion, his coffee mug hovering inches above his lap. Riddle's eyebrows lifted in sheer disbelief and stayed there. Steele turned his head toward the back row, fixing his gaze on Mara, who sat in her usual seat with the exact same unreadable composure, offering nothing to the room's shock. "Delgado," Ferris said. "Sir? Care to tell me why nobody in this wardroom even knew you submitted a package?" Mara considered the question with her characteristic care, arriving at the only practical truth. "Nobody asked, sir." A couple of nervous, muffled chuckles rippled through the rows, only to die out instantly. Ferris did not smile. He continued reading from the board's official endorsement. "The evaluation contained commendations rarely seen on junior officer boards. An exceptionally mature grasp of dynamic, three-dimensional tactical geometry typically observed only in senior weapons school graduates. On the merge doctrine section, a brutal scenario designed to fail half the applicants, she hadn't merely passed. She had engineered an unconventional tactical solution so elegant that two senior evaluators subsequently incorporated it into their own syllabus. She had spent months laying the groundwork, the 0400 simulator sessions, the midnight calculations, the forgotten mishap logs. And she had never once demanded the squadron's validation before the outcome was secured. The days that followed brought a quiet recalibration across the squadron. There were no dramatic apologies or grand speeches, but the atmosphere altered decisively, as it always does when undeniable performance replaces an unexamined narrative.
Hammer remained unusually quiet for 2 full days. On the third morning, he approached Mara near an open engine bay in the hangar and asked, entirely devoid of his usual swagger, if she would mind walking him through her merged geometry logic. She agreed without hesitation, spending 40 minutes at a metal folding table, sketching branching decision trees 3 moves ahead, the exact way a Grand Master calculates beyond the immediate capture. Hammer listened with the focused humility of someone realizing they had drastically misjudged an opponent. Later that evening at the club, Riddle openly admitted she had misread Mara from day one. Steele said nothing directly, but when the next flight schedule was published, he had paired himself with her for an advanced 2-ship tactical sortie, the highest unspoken compliment a senior aviator could offer. Commander Ferris penned a remark in her fitness report that would anchor her reputation for the rest of her career. Mara departed for NAS Fallon in April. The detachment proved to be every bit as relentless as its reputation promised. Dissimilar air combat training stacked daily against seasoned adversary instructors flying specialized aircraft designed to ruthlessly exploit any tactical blind spot. Sorties ran back-to-back, each followed by 3-hour, frame-by-frame debriefings. Early on, Mara struggled. During her 4th sortie, flying a complex defensive engagement against 2 split bogies, she hesitated on a critical aspect angle read by less than half a second. She suffered a simulated gun kill. She then had to endure a brutal debrief where a veteran instructor pulled apart her HUD video frame by frame in front of 5 other candidates. For many pilots, that level of public dissection would have validated their deepest insecurities. That evening, back in the visiting quarters, Mara allowed herself to feel the sting of the mistake for precisely the 20 minutes it took to finish her dinner. Then, she opened her laptop. She replayed the cockpit HUD footage 11 consecutive times, charting each switch actuation and stick deflection on a yellow legal pad in her private shorthand, until she had completely deconstructed the tactical geometry. She viewed the failure not as an indictment, but as data. Pure, actionable information she hadn't possessed before, and now did. 2 other pilots gunned that week reacted along familiar lines. One complained bitterly that the adversary had cheated the floor parameters, while the other grew visibly hesitant, his confidence eroding sortie by sortie. Mara did neither. She approached the adversary instructor cadre and politely requested 15 minutes outside the normal debrief window to review the tape. A notoriously stern commander granted the request out of sheer curiosity. 40 minutes later, while scrutinizing the high G-merge frame by frame, the commander was no longer just answering her technical inquiries. He was asking her how she had anticipated the secondary bandit's vertical offset. 4 days later, Mara flew the identical defensive scenario. She neutralized the threat and scored a clean, decisive kill, handling the engagement with a precision that left the debrief room far quieter than her earlier loss had. Where most aviators flew a rematch with tentative overcorrection, Mara flew it with measured aggression, applying speed where required and patience where essential. The solution was never about flying timidly. It was about anticipating that crucial half-second of spatial awareness. In modern air combat, half a second is the difference between surviving and dying. By the end of the 6-week course, the instructor staff no longer viewed her as an unassuming newcomer. They treated her like an aviator they fully expected to see wearing an instructor patch within a few years. During her final graduation evaluation, she executed a high-aspect defensive-to-offensive reversal so textbook that the staff archived the footage for future classes. After the final debrief, the lead instructor, a seasoned veteran known for his complete lack of unearned flattery, leaned across the table. "Delgado, where on earth have you been hiding?" "Just working through the fundamentals, sir," she answered smoothly. Call signs in naval aviation are earned through time, performance, and the collective observation of peers. Fallon tradition dictated that the detachment's top overall performer received their call sign directly from the instructor cadre before the entire graduating class on the final night. Few outsiders would have anticipated the quiet junior officer from Lemoore standing at the front of the room. But the instructors knew precisely why she was there. The lead instructor held a dry erase marker, trading humorous jabs and recounting embarrassing blunders before scribbling customary call signs across the whiteboard. When he reached Mara, the room fell into an attentive hush, not of amusement, but of genuine respect. Because no one had an embarrassing story to exploit. He looked down at his notes for a long beat, then deliberately set the marker flat on the podium. "I've run this course for 11 years, the commander began. "I've assigned a lot of call signs. Most of them are jokes. This one isn't going to be." He detailed her innovative merge doctrine solution that had been integrated into their tactical syllabus. He spoke of her 4th sortie failure, the 11 HUD replays, and the flawless redemption flight 4 days later. He mentioned that her final graduation tape was already being indexed as primary instructional footage. "She never said more than 2 words about any of it the entire time she was here," he said quietly. "Not because she couldn't, but because her flying did all the talking." He picked up the marker, turned to the whiteboard, and wrote a single word in bold block letters. "Whisper." Nobody laughed. The room of combat pilots, who had spent 6 grueling weeks enduring relentless scrutiny, sat in profound silence. It was the realization that they had shared a workspace with an elite tactician whose true caliber they had only fully understood once it was officially proclaimed. Mara sat with her hands resting calmly on the table, maintaining the exact posture she had kept since reporting to Lemoore, and spoke clearly. "Thank you, sir." It was the exact and complete measure of what needed to be said. She flew back into NAS Lemoore 2 days later, her sea bag slung over the same shoulder. Although no official bulletin had been broadcast, word in naval aviation travels with incredible speed. By the time her jet touched down, the squadron already knew the outcome. When she stepped through the ready room hatch, every head turned. Hammer stood up first. "Whisper, huh?" he said, with a genuine self-deprecating grin, his way of offering an apology. Riddle quietly pulled out the chair beside her own. Steele offered a single, resolute nod from the front row, a gesture carrying more weight than a standing ovation. Mara set her gear down, took the offered seat, and let the squadron's banter wash over her. The bulkhead photos in the whiteboard had not changed, but the room had transformed in every meaningful way. Years later, following 2 combat deployments and a distinguished tour as a tactics instructor,
Mara sat for a rare interview with a Navy public affairs writer composing a profile on strike fighter pilots. She answered every inquiry with clear precision, gently but firmly refusing any attempt to romanticize her journey. When asked about that initial Wednesday in the ready room and the dismissive remark about her library energy, Mara paused briefly before answering that she had barely registered it at the time. Other people's superficial assessments of her capabilities had never been actionable intelligence in any cockpit. When asked what sustained her through the most grueling phases of Fallon, she offered a thoughtful response. "I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone," she explained. "Not to the wardroom, not to the guy cracking jokes, and not to the selection board. I wasn't running away from anything, either. I just needed to confirm whether what I believed about my own standard was genuinely true. I had carried that standard for years. I simply had to test it against reality." She had tested it, and her conviction had held firm. The reality regarding pilots like Mara Delgado, the quiet professionals occupying the back row, the ones overlooked because they refuse to perform for an audience, is that they are almost always proven right long before the world catches up. They take the 0-400 simulator blocks, master the mishap reports nobody assigned, and correct their mistakes in silence. They do not work for applause. They work for mastery. When the decisive moment arrives, when the selection dispatch is read, when the name is written on the board, and when the room finally falls silent enough to perceive the truth, they are ready. They were always ready. Back in El Centro, New Mexico, a narrow agricultural airstrip still borders the sun-baked cotton fields. Its orange windsock hangs faded from years of desert heat, waiting for a pilot who no longer relies on it to fly, yet still stops by whenever she returns home. Her uncle notes that she rarely says much during those visits. She simply stands beside the tie-down chains for a quiet stretch, her hand resting flat against the weathered fence post, greeting an old mentor whose lessons never required repeating. Out there, nobody wears flight patches or makes noise to claim space. It was the very first ready room she ever knew, and the place that taught her the fundamental law of flight. The sky never cares how loudly you introduce yourself when you enter a room. It only cares whether you were paying complete attention while everyone else was distracted.